Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we have an update from Sudan where at least 7 protesters have been killed by security forces. We have an update from the upcoming French presidential elections, and we're talking about Houthi strikes on oil facilities in the UAE. First up, at least 7 people were killed as they demonstrated on Monday in Sudan. Reports from multiple news agencies tell us that as crowds of people marched chanting slogans and waving flags, Sudanese security forces opened fire on the protesters, killing at least 7 and injuring several others. Monday's deaths take the toll up to at least 67. That's the number of people that have been killed in the near daily demonstrations. But despite this deadly security clampdown, protesters are undeterred in their opposition to military rule. A reminder that in Khartoum, its twin city of Omdurman in Port Sudan, and in Wad Madani Obaid, as well as the Western Darfur region, thousands continue to oppose General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's rule. For the latest, Prashant joins us now. Prashant, what's the latest you're hearing from the ground first?
Right. So, of course, like we talked about this multiple times on this show before, this is a continuation of a series of protests which have been going on since the October 25th coup, and these protests really intensified in December when what was called a March of the Millions, which used to be a one-off affair once in a couple of months, became a very regular, almost weekly phenomenon. And at the same time, we've also seen the repression increasing manifold as far as the military and security forces are concerned. So at the center lies the resistance of the protesters to the military rule. We know that at the beginning of the month, the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, who himself was almost a puppet in some senses because he was completely under the control of the military structure, resigned, saying that even he could not, that Sudan's future lies at a crossroads. He was saying that even he could not take the fact that he had basically no authority at all after being reinstated in November. So since then, the protests have only intensified. The repression has, been very, irregular, almost routine by right now in the sense of tear gas being used. There are accusations of ammunition being used, protesters being attacked not only on the roads but also on the hospitals, and the fact that there's been continuous attempts by the government to ensure that say protesters from various parts of the Khartoum region, for instance, are not able to gather together. Many of the bridges are regularly being blocked. So all this and more is in our reports on People's Dispatch as well. In fact, there was a recent instance, the last week's protest, for instance, there was an interesting incident when the protest in Khartoum itself was postponed to the next day. And, there was finally no protest took place at all because although the announcement was made at the last moment, nonetheless, no protest took place, which itself shows how much disciplined the protesters are. The fact that these are not random incidents of people coming out on the ground or anything only spontaneous, but actually a very well organized series of protests, which I think often the Western media sort of misses out while writing about it. The fact that these are not just sporadic or spontaneous protests, but part of a very organized, very consistent move to sort of express opposition to the military rule. And the fact that within a very short time, the protest committees were able to actually make sure that nobody came on the streets and the security forces were left waiting there shows really that there is quite a considerable amount of discipline. And I think security forces also responding to this very brutally. Like we said yesterday, saw even more deaths. And I think this is unfortunately likely to continue in every single cycle that we witness, because there have been multiple instances of people being shot, people being hit with tear gas, people being attacked in hospitals, like I said. So these protests definitely are set to continue in the coming days and weeks as well. A 2-day campaign of civil disobedience also has been called, if I'm not wrong. So definitely the protesters being very clear that they're not looking to back down at all. They're very clear that they want no compromise, no coalition, though that's pretty much the slogan on the streets. And as we know, these organizations led by the Sudanese Professionals Association, the Communist Party is involved, Sudanese Communist Party, the resistance committees are very active. So all these are actually very much in control and very much directing the protests on the streets.
Right. So like you're saying, probably the strength in the organization is what's allowing them to also continue unabated. In that context, what is the broader current political scenario in terms of who is ruling and controlling what?
Right. So by now it's pretty very clear that the military under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is completely in control of the country in terms of the administrative structures. So the Sovereignty Council, for instance, which was initially installed and completely taken over by the military, is very much in power. Now, the United Nations has said that it wants to organize talks to sort of, look at the possibility of some kind of resolution to the conflict. And some of the sections of the anti-military movement, the Forces of Freedom and Change, for instance, which was a major political bloc that was in power in Sudan along with the military from 2019 onwards to 2021 October, when they were all removed by the military. This group has indicated that it is willing to participate in the talks. Now, we do know also that the US envoy, special envoy for the Horn of Africa, which is that that region, is expected to visit Khartoum in Sudan this week, talk to various sections of activists. We really don't know in terms of what exact agenda the United States is proposing. But we do know that the United Nations, the US, for instance, in the past have been, inclined to support a semi-transition, a transition where, the facade of democracy is still very much there, where you have a prime minister, for instance, or a cabinet, but where the military still is very much in control. For instance, after the October 25th coup, which Burhan took over power, when he reinstated Hamdok, what we saw was that the United States, the UN, and all these Western powers were pretty happy with it, because there was a face-saving civilian figure heading the government, so to speak. So they would be, in fact, quite happy with some kind of a, return to this kind of a structure where, even though the military is completely in power, there are certain civilian figureheads in positions of authority. And the Forces of Freedom and Change, of course, have said that they want a full democratic transition to civilian government. Now, the question is, what does this transition mean? So every section of the protesters has a different understanding of what transition is. So we do know that for the people on the street, though, the people who have been suffering these sacrifices, who have been making these sacrifices, suffering these deaths, they're very clear that they don't want halfway compromise, or they don't want a negotiation which will restore the old status quo, which is basically of the military basically being largely in control of Sudan. And we need to know, of course, that the military is also a key contributor, a key owner of Sudan's economy. So it's not just, sitting in positions of government, but the economic structure itself on which the military has a stranglehold. So one of the key slogans of the protest movement has been actually to try to remove this kind of control, and similarly with foreign affairs also, so that Sudan can chart out a more independent foreign policy. Whereas we also do know that sections of the military are happy that it's closely aligned to Israel. So keeping all this in mind, I think it will be important to see what these diplomatic maneuvers in the coming week with the Horn of Africa envoy are likely to lead. But I think for the protesters, the message is very clear.
Very clear. Right. Thanks for that update, Prashant. And I'll ask you to stick around for the next story as well. French far-right presidential candidate Eric Zemmour was fined 10,000 euros, which is about 11,500 US dollars on Monday, for inciting racial hatred over remarks on a television channel, in which he called young migrants killers, thieves, and even rapists. Zemmour, you might remember, is a former political commentator and is competing with the more established far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, as well as conservative Valérie Pécresse, for a chance to challenge centre-right President Emmanuel Macron in France's presidential elections, which are coming up in April of this year. Prashant, to start with, what is this particular case?
Right, Siddharth, like you said, this comes from a comment he made in a TV discussion, I believe, in 2020, where he said these reprehensible things, horrible things about unaccompanied migrant children. So, I think he was asked about some incident of violence, and this was his response, that they're murderers, rapists, etc. So this kind of indicates, I think, of course, what his politics is and what he's exactly been trying to do, not only over the past few months as part of his presidential campaign, but this has actually been, in some senses, a lifelong quest for him for quite some time. So this is his third conviction for inciting racial hatred. This has happened in the past in 2011 and I believe 2016 also, where he made similarly very horrible comments about racial minorities. I think once he attributed a lot of drug trade to Arabs, for instance. And generally, all his comments, for instance, even say comments which have not been so directly racist and so directly, vicious, have in some senses nonetheless strengthened this narrative of the minorities, of, say, for instance, of Muslims, of black people, of migrants, all of them being some kind of seedy underbelly of France, or some kind of, external threat to the French nation.
And definitely unwelcome.
And definitely unwelcome, exactly. And so that has really been, Zemmour's, his overall arc of his work, that has really been about, that's what it's been about. So there's this whole thing about, for instance, the fact that what is called the great replacement theory, which is one of the most vicious philosophies of the right across the world, in many parts of the world, in where it sort of stipulates that the people of Europe, for instance, the white people, are being displaced by migrants, people from black people, for instance, people from West Asia. There's this whole displacement, taking part, so to speak. So that's of course one aspect of his. That's been his larger body of work, so to speak. And it's, again, one interesting thing that has come out is the fact that, for instance, he's also sought to defend the French collaborators with the Nazis in World War II. And in fact, earlier, he had been, there was a case against him for that, for claiming that the Vichy government of Marshal Pétain was, he said that they tried to protect the Jews. And at that point, the case was, settled or dismissed, saying that it was an off-the-cuff, on a heat of the moment kind of comment. But now he's I think repeated that again. So at which point prosecutors are planning to bring back the case. So there have been like multiple instances of legal action being initiated, of popular action being initiated. But this is a bit of a dicey move, so to speak, because all this does is, in some senses, it actually reiterates the stance Zemmour is taking and allows him also to sort of portray himself as some kind of political victim of political correctness, or some kind of free speech warrior, so to speak, which is a familiar tactic used by right-wing leaders across the world. People, Trump, for instance, saying that social media is censoring him, etc., etc. So in some senses, it follows the classic far right-wing playbook, and we need to, of course, see, while it's essential that people like him sort of be convicted for what he said, it also has this effect.
Yeah. And I think his lawyers have also come out and said that even in this case, he will be appealing because, like you rightly said, freedom of expression and all that. So in that context, with the right sort of not backing down from its, and like you also pointed out, very vicious stance in this campaign, how is the broader campaign progressing across the spectrum?
Right. So it's interesting, of course, note that Eric Zemmour might not even be able to contest for the presidential elections because there is a stipulation that I think at least 500 elected officials need to endorse his candidature. He hasn't been able to get that yet. Whether he will be able to is a different question. And we do know that actually, while he did sort of start out very strong in the opinion polls towards the end of last year, over time his the enthusiasm about him has kind of waned. So he's actually right now placed fourth in the list of potential candidates. So there's Macron, who's leading by a fairly decent margin, Marine Le Pen, Valérie Pécresse, and then Zemmour. So there's a very good chance, for instance, that the Zemmour candidature might fade away. It might not get the necessary support for him to even stand in the elections. And there's a very good chance, of course, that he is not going to progress into the second round. But I think the larger threat here is something different altogether, which is that by having a candidate such as him in the political field, what it does is it enables the whole political spectrum to shift in that direction. Because we've seen this, for instance, with a country like Israel as well, and many other countries, even India for that matter, some United States as well. When figures such as these contest in the elections, what happens is that what the whole political discourse, political thinking, all of it shifts much more to the right, which means that even Emmanuel Macron can be comfortable taking a position slightly more left of Zemmour, but which is still very right-wing, right? So, but he can always differentiate himself, saying that I'm not that right-wing, right? So, what really happens here is basically that the whole spectrum shifts, right? That's one thing. Secondly, of course, the views of a small minority, and we have to be very clear that most analysts, for instance, don't interpret Zemmour's views as that of the majority of the people. The views of a small minority, because of how drastic they are, because of how how much they stand out on the kind of media coverage that it gets as well. And even we are discussing this right now. So they become more and more legitimized. For instance, this idea of this great replacement theory, right? They get more and more legitimized. They get more and more talked about. And it's important to note that he is actually supported by one of the biggest media networks in France as well. And his career has continuously been endorsed and supported by this media network, which is also run by a billionaire. So he's again not existing in a vacuum of this one lone wolf, although he likes to portray himself like that. He's actually very much a creature of the establishment, so to speak. So this is actually a bit of a risk, because it allows Marine Le Pen, for instance, to paint herself as a reasonable person. It allows Macron and Valérie Pécresse, for instance, who are right-wing candidates, to paint themselves as reasonable persons, while nonetheless using the same problematic policies that have destroyed the French public sector, the same attacks on French workers, for instance, and the same attacks on minorities and other other communities as well. So all this gets far more legitimized when a candidate like him is able to contest. So that's, I think, really the larger threat, larger danger to the French political system.
Right. So a reminder, like you said, April is that presidential election, and I think in the lead up we'll have a lot more conversation around what's happening in France. Thanks very much, Prashant, for that. Now for our final story of the day. A suspected drone strike by Yemen's Houthi rebels yesterday, that's Monday, on oil facilities, key oil facilities in Abu Dhabi have killed at least 3 people and started a separate fire near the international airport there. For the latest on that story, I spoke earlier to People's Dispatch's Abdul via video conference. Abdul, so what are the latest reports you're hearing from Abu Dhabi as well as Yemen?
As far as the latest news is concerned, last we heard that Saudi coalition forces have started bombing Sana'a and other areas in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which has killed around 12 people. There are other reports which are indicating even the greater number of casualties, but around 12 people, there is a confirmed news that 12 people have died and around a dozen people have been injured, primarily because the bombing is in civilian areas. So what Saudis are saying that this is a retaliation, but in a way this is a continuation of their 7-year-long war against Yemeni people. Yesterday, as we all know by now, that the Houthis basically launched an attack on Abu Dhabi. First time in the 7-year-long history of the war, they launched an attack on UAE, though they have been launching similar attacks against Saudi Arabia, the leader of the coalition against them. But this is for the first time that they launched a strike on UAE, and that too on one of the major cities, which basically led to the death of 3 people. All 3 of them are migrants coming from India and Pakistan, but it shows many other things, which basically a sign of a new escalation in the war, which is going on for the last 7 years. Yeah.
Right. So these attacks on UAE soil, etc., and of course, like you said, the continuation of the coalition attacks on rebel-held territories. What does that tell us as far as the current scenario in the region is concerned, as well as how things might look, since we're talking about this for the first time in 2022 also?
So yesterday's attack on Abu Dhabi basically shows that Houthis have acquired newer capabilities for sure. And they, as their spokesperson said during the press conference yesterday, this is an attempt to kind of pressurize all the coalition partners in Saudi Arabia to back out. That they are not the enemies. There is nothing against the people of UAE or people of other regional allies of Saudi coalition. It is an attempt to kind of give a hint that it is, if you want to avoid more harm, physical harm, which we are capable of, we should, in a way, it is a way of pressurizing Saudi Arabia further to come to the negotiation table and accept what Houthis are saying. As we all know, the basic Houthi demand has been that the Saudi Arabia should leave its agenda of kind of attempt to reinstate Mansour al-Hadi in power. The moment this coalitions are, the territories of say UAE and other countries are threatened, of course they have more to lose, more in terms of material loss and in terms as of well as political and politically also face, because they are quote unquote richer countries, they have greater quote unquote capabilities and all. Right. So if Houthis are capable of attacking them, harming them physically, it is of course it is not in the plan of things. So the attack basically is indication that Houthis are pushing Saudi coalition to kind of stop their allying with Saudi Arabia, which we don't know what will happen in the future, as we already know that they have retaliated. But it will be a difficult issue now to decide for UAE policymakers whether they will be able to continue the way they have been, they were continuing all this while. So it may change the course of war in Yemen.
All right. Thanks very much for that important update, Abdul. That's all we have on the show today. You've been watching Daily Debrief. For more on these stories and all of the work that People's Dispatch does, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And also, please follow us on all the regular social media platforms. We'll be back again with the show, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.